The Meridian Hotel's crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled crowd of investors, board members, and business partners. I should have felt proud watching my son David command the room, his tailored suit impeccable, his presentation polished. After all, Hartwell Industries had been my life's work for 32 years. But pride turned to ice when I approached his circle during the cocktail hour. David, I've been reviewing the quarterly projections, and I think we should discuss the expansion timeline. Mom. His voice cut through the conversation like a blade, stopping mid-sentence. The group of investors fell silent, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Stay out of my business. The words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. Laughter rippled through the circle, nervous at first, then emboldened by David's confident smirk. She still thinks she runs the show, he said to James Morrison, our largest investor, as if I wasn't standing right there. Old habits die hard, I guess. More laughter. Louder this time. I felt my cheeks burn as 20 pairs of eyes looked anywhere but at me. The woman who had built this company from a struggling startup to a multi-million-dollar enterprise was being dismissed like an interfering relative at a family barbecue. Of course, I managed, my voice steady despite the earthquake inside my chest. My mistake. I walked away on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, leaving behind the sound of my son's voice resuming his pitch, the investors already having forgotten I existed. The leather seats of David's BMW felt cold against my back as we drove home in suffocating silence. Street lights flashed past the windows, each one illuminating another replay of the humiliation in my mind. Stay out of my business, asterisk. The words echoed with each heartbeat. My business. The company I'd started in my garage 32 years ago when David was still in diapers. The business I'd nursed through 2 recessions, countless sleepless nights, and years of 14-hour days while his father traveled and David grew up thinking success just magically appeared. I stared at his profile in the driver's seat, the strong jaw I'd given him, the determined set of his shoulders that reminded me painfully of myself at his age. When had he become this stranger? When had my ambitious, loving son transformed into someone who could humiliate his own mother in front of a room full of people? The Morrison meeting went well, he said finally, his tone casual, as if the last hour had never happened. Yes, I replied, because what else was there to say? He's definitely interested in the European expansion. I think we can close the deal by next quarter.
We.
As if I was still part of the equation. As if I hadn't just been publicly relegated to the role of meddling mother whose opinions didn't matter. I closed my eyes and felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. If David wanted me out of his business, perhaps it was time to remind him exactly whose business it really was. Richard was reading his newspaper in his leather recliner when I walked into our living room, still shaking from the evening's events. He looked up briefly, taking in my pale face and clenched fists. How was the dinner? Your son humiliated me in front of 20 investors, I said, my voice barely controlled. Richard sighed and folded his paper with the same patience he'd shown when David was a teenager coming home past curfew. What did you do now, Helen? What did I do? The question was like a slap. I tried to participate in a discussion about my own company. David's company, Richard corrected gently. He's been running it for 3 years now. You need to let him spread his wings. Spread his wings? I stared at my husband of 35 years, this man who had supported my business dreams when they were convenient and dismissed them when they weren't. He told me to stay out of his business. In front of everyone. He's ambitious, Helen. That's a good thing. Don't interfere with his confidence. Interfere. As if my 3 decades of experience, my relationships with every major client, my intimate knowledge of every aspect of the business, was just interference. I built that company, Richard. And now he's building it bigger. Isn't that what every parent wants? For their child to surpass them? I looked at this man I'd married, this man who had watched me sacrifice everything to build something lasting, and realized with crystalline clarity that I was completely, utterly alone. You're right, I said quietly. I should let him handle his own business. Richard smiled and reopened his newspaper, missing the dangerous edge in my voice entirely. I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., I found myself scrolling through David's LinkedIn profile on my phone, a masochistic impulse I couldn't resist. His latest post, published just hours after our dinner, made my blood run cold. Amazing investor dinner tonight. Sometimes you have to cut through the noise and focus on the future. The older generation means well, but vision requires fresh thinking. Excited to take Hartwell Industries to heights they never imagined possible. Innovation #leadership vision. The comments were already rolling in. So true. Old school thinking holds back progress. Lead with confidence, David. Don't let anyone dim your vision. Every successful leader has to break free from the past eventually. The older generation. Old school thinking.
The past. He was talking about me.
His own mother. The woman who had built the foundation he was standing on, dismissing me as obsolete noise that needed to be cut through. I screenshot the post, my hands trembling with rage. 347 likes. Dozens of comments from employees, competitors, and industry contacts, all applauding my son for his independence and vision. None of them knew that the old-school thinking he was dismissing had created every single job in that company. None of them realized that the noise he was cutting through was the voice of the woman who still, legally and quietly, held the controlling interest in Hartwell Industries. But they would learn.
Soon.
I locked my bedroom door and sat on the edge of my bed, David's phone still glowing in my hands. The post had gained another 50 likes in the past hour. The humiliation was going viral in our small business community. Old and irrelevant, I whispered to my reflection in the dark window. Noise to be cut through. 32 years. I'd given 32 years of my life to building something meaningful, something lasting. I'd missed school plays and soccer games. I'd worked through Christmas mornings and anniversaries. I'd poured my soul into creating something that could provide for my family and employ hundreds of people. And this was my reward. Public dismissal. Online mockery. Being treated like a relic from a bygone era by the very person who should have honored what I'd built. I walked to my closet and pulled out the locked file box I kept on the top shelf. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, the original incorporation papers, the stock certificates, the legal agreements that had been forgotten in the day-to-day operations of running a business. The documents that proved, in black and white, that despite David's assumptions and everyone else's perceptions, Helen Hartwell still owned 62% of Hartwell Industries. If he wants me out, I said to the empty room, my voice steady for the first time in hours, I'll show him what out really means. I pulled my laptop onto the bed and began typing an email to my lawyer. It was time to remind my son and everyone else exactly who they were dealing with. Saturday morning found me in my home office, papers spread across every surface like evidence in a detective novel. The locked file box sat open on my desk, its contents revealing a truth that had been obscured by years of David's increasing confidence and my own willingness to step back. The original incorporation papers from 1991 were yellowed but clear. Helen Hartwell, founder and majority shareholder, 62%. The subsequent documents told the story I'd forgotten. When I'd brought in Richard as chief financial officer 10 years later, I'd given him 15%. When David graduated business school and joined the company, I'd transferred 20% to him as a gesture of faith in his future. But I'd never given up control. I'd never signed away my majority stake. In the daily grind of operations, with David taking on more responsibilities and making more decisions, everyone, including me, had begun acting as if he owned the company. But legally, contractually, unequivocally, I was still the majority shareholder. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Board meeting Tuesday at 10. We're finalizing the European expansion proposal. Not, would you like to attend? Or, your input would be valuable. Just an informational message, as if I were a secretary being notified of someone else's schedule. I stared at the message, then at the stock certificates in my hands. 62%. More than enough to override any decision, fire any executive, change any direction. More than enough to remind my son, who really owned this company. That night, while Richard slept, I reviewed every financial document I could access through the company's online portal. What I found made my stomach turn. David had been aggressive, recklessly so. The European expansion he was so excited about was financed through loans that put the company dangerously close to its credit limits. He'd purchased new equipment, expanded the workforce, and committed to lease agreements that assumed a level of growth that was optimistic at best, delusional at worst. The quarterly reports painted a picture of rapid expansion, but between the lines, I could see the foundation cracking. Cash flow was tight. Debt-to-equity ratios were climbing. Several of our smaller clients had defaulted on payments, creating gaps that David had papered over with creative accounting. Most damning of all were the consulting fees. Payments to strategic advisors and external consultants that totaled nearly $200,000 in the past year. I couldn't identify any of these consultants, couldn't find contracts or deliverables that justified these expenses. Either David was being extraordinarily wasteful with company resources, or something more serious was happening. I screenshot everything, building a file that told a very different story than the confident growth narrative David had been presenting to investors. This wasn't visionary leadership. This was reckless spending disguised as ambition. By 3 a.m., I had enough evidence to destroy his credibility completely. But I wasn't ready to pull that trigger yet. First, I needed to understand exactly how deep this went. Patricia Kendall had been my attorney for 15 years, handling everything from contract negotiations to my estate planning. Her downtown office overlooked the harbor, and her reputation for corporate law was unmatched in the city. "Helen," she said, rising from behind her mahogany desk with genuine pleasure. "It's been too long. How's retirement treating you?" "That's actually why I'm here, Patricia. I'm not sure I'm as retired as everyone thinks." Her eyebrows rose as I spread the documents across her conference table. She examined each paper with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most feared attorneys in the state. "These are all valid," she said finally. "Current and binding. Helen, you realize what this means? Tell me what you see." "You own controlling interest in Hartwell Industries. 62% gives you the power to override any board decision, remove any officer, change any corporate direction." She looked up at me with something that might have been admiration. "Your son has been operating under a false assumption. Can this be challenged?" "Absolutely not. These documents are ironclad. Filed with the state, properly notarized, never rescinded or modified." Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. "Helen, you don't just have a seat at the table. You own the table." I felt something powerful uncoiling in my chest. Not anger anymore, but something colder and more focused. "What would you recommend as my next step?" "That depends on what you want to accomplish. Do you want to resume active control, or simply ensure your voice is heard?" I thought about David's dismissive tone, his social media post, the sound of investors laughing at my expense. I want to remind everyone who they're really working for. The company's monthly social gathering was held at the Riverside Country Club, a tradition I'd started years ago to build team morale. I arrived early, positioning myself near the bar where I could observe without being the center of attention. David held court near the windows overlooking the golf course, surrounded by department heads and rising executives. He looked confident, relaxed, every inch the successful CEO. The golden boy who'd inherited an empire and was making it his own. When he called for attention and raised his glass, the room quieted immediately. "I want to thank everyone for another incredible month," he began, his voice carrying easily across the space. "The Morrison deal is moving forward, the European expansion is on track, and our Q3 numbers are going to exceed all projections." Applause rippled through the crowd. I noticed Sarah Chun, our head of HR, clapping with less enthusiasm than the others. Michael Torres from accounting looked uncomfortable. Small cracks in David's facade of universal support. "But more importantly," David continued, "I want to celebrate what we've become as a team. We're no longer bound by old ways of thinking or conservative approaches that held us back. We're building something revolutionary here, a company that's not afraid to take risks, not afraid to push boundaries." Old ways of thinking. Conservative approaches. Again with the coded language dismissing everything I'd built. So here's to the future, he said, raising his glass higher. To my empire, and to everyone who's brave enough to join me in building it. My empire. Asterisk, the words echoed across the room as glasses clinked and people cheered. I sipped my wine and smiled, watching my son bask in the adoration of people who had no idea they were celebrating a lie. Let him enjoy this moment. Soon enough, he'd learn that empires built on false foundations have a tendency to crumble. Walking to my car after the gathering, I was stopped by Margaret Foster, our longest-serving employee. She'd been with the company since the early days, had watched it grow from a small operation to its current size. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Could I have a word?" "Of course, Margaret. I don't know if I should be saying this, but some of us are worried about the direction things are going." "Oh, David's a smart young man, don't get me wrong. But he's moving so fast, making so many changes. Some of the older employees feel like we're being pushed out, like our experience doesn't matter anymore." I studied her face, seeing the uncertainty there. Margaret had been loyal to me for 25 years. If she was speaking up, others were feeling the same way. "What specifically concerns you?" "The spending mostly. And the way he talks about the new vision like everything we built before was somehow wrong." She hesitated. "We all know you're not as involved anymore, but, well, we miss having your steady hand on things." That night, I sat in my office with a legal pad, sketching out a plan. David wanted to play power games? Fine. But he was playing against someone who had built this company from nothing, who understood every relationship, every weakness, every pressure point. I wouldn't destroy him. That would be too easy. Instead, I'd let him expose himself, let his own arrogance and recklessness create the conditions for his downfall. I'd give him enough rope to hang himself, then step forward at the perfect moment to remind everyone who really held the power. The game was about to begin, and my son had no idea he was already losing. The coffee shop on Elm Street was perfectly anonymous, far enough from the office district that we wouldn't run into anyone from the company, small enough that conversations could remain private. I'd chosen it carefully for my first meeting with Margaret Foster. "Thank you for coming," I said as she settled into the booth across from me. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope I didn't overstep the other night." "Not at all. In fact, I'm hoping you can help me understand what's really happening at the company." For the next hour, Margaret painted a picture that was even worse than I'd suspected. David had created an inner circle of young executives who shared his vision, while systematically marginalizing anyone who questioned his decisions. Long-term employees were being reassigned to lesser roles or encouraged to take early retirement. "He's building his own empire," Margaret said sadly. "But he's forgetting that the foundation was built by people who knew what they were doing." Over the following week, I had similar conversations with 5 other key employees. Michael Torres confirmed my suspicions about the questionable consulting fees, payments to companies he'd never heard of for services he couldn't identify. Sarah Chin revealed that several experienced employees had already updated their resumes, concerned about the company's direction. Most importantly, I learned that despite David's confident presentations, he'd lost 3 major clients in the past 6 months. Companies that had been with us for years, who'd specifically asked to work with me, were taking their business elsewhere when they learned I was no longer actively involved. By Friday, I had a clear picture. David was systematically dismantling everything I'd built, replacing proven relationships and processes with his own untested vision. And the company was hemorrhaging both talent and revenue as a result. I began spending more time at the office, arriving early and staying late, positioning myself as a quiet observer rather than an active participant. David seemed pleased that I was finally accepting my reduced role, never suspecting that I was actually documenting his every move. I watched him in meetings, noting how he dominated conversations and dismissed alternative viewpoints. I observed his interactions with staff, seeing how the atmosphere had changed from the collaborative environment I'd fostered to something more hierarchical and tense. Most telling were the financial discussions. David spoke confidently about projections and growth targets, But when pressed for details by board members, his answers were vague or defensive. He was clearly in over his head, masking inexperience with bravado. The European expansion that he'd touted as his masterpiece was particularly concerning. The market research was superficial, the financial projections were wildly optimistic, and the timeline was completely unrealistic. It was the kind of plan that looked impressive in a PowerPoint presentation, but would collapse under scrutiny. I started keeping a detailed log of every questionable decision, every missed opportunity, every sign that David's leadership was putting the company at risk. Not to use immediately, but to have ready when the time came to act. Because that time was coming. I could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. First National Bank had been Hartwell Industries' primary financial institution for over 20 years. When I called to rec, "Mrs. Hartwell," said James Patterson, rising from behind his desk. "What a pleasure. How can I help you today? I need to make some changes to the company's banking arrangements." For the next hour, I restructured our accounts in ways that would give me greater oversight of company finances. As the majority shareholder, I had every legal right to require dual approval for any expenditure over $50,000. I also arranged for detailed monthly reports to be sent directly to my attention. "These changes will take effect immediately?" I asked. "Within 24 hours, Patterson confirmed. "Though I should mention that this might come as a surprise to your son. He's been operating with full financial authority for some time now." "I'm sure David will adjust," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The next morning, I received a furious phone call. "Mom, what the hell did you do to our bank accounts?" I exercised my rights as majority shareholder to ensure proper financial oversight. "Financial oversight? I can't even approve the new marketing campaign without your signature now." "That's correct. Any expenditure over $50,000 requires my approval." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, David's voice came through, tight with barely controlled anger. "We need to talk." "Yes," I said calmly. "We do." The call to Brennan and Associates, the city's most prestigious accounting firm, was brief and to the point. "I need an independent audit of Hartwell Industries," I told Susan Brennan directly. "Complete financial review, with particular attention to consulting fees and expenditure authorization." "Any specific concerns, Mrs. Hartwell?" "Let's call it due diligence. I want to ensure that company resources are being used appropriately. I can have a team there Monday morning." "Excellent. And Susan?" "This audit is being requested by the majority shareholder. All company records should be made available immediately." When the auditors arrived at the office Monday morning, the effect was immediate and dramatic. I watched from my temporary office as whispers spread through the departments. David emerged from his office looking pale and shaken, clearly caught off guard by the sudden scrutiny. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, approaching my desk with forced calm. "Could you explain why auditors are crawling through our files?" "Routine review," I said without looking up from my computer. "Nothing to worry about if everything's in order. But we just had our annual audit 6 months ago. This is a special audit, focused on operational efficiency and resource allocation." David's jaw tightened. "You should have discussed this with me first." "Should I have?" I looked up at him with genuine curiosity. I wasn't aware that majority shareholders needed permission to audit their own companies. The color drained from his face as the implications hit him. For years, he'd been operating as if he owned the company. Now, suddenly, he was being reminded that he was actually an employee, one who could be held accountable for his decisions. The rumors started within hours of the auditor's arrival. By Wednesday, they'd reached fever pitch. I watched David try to maintain his confident facade, but the stress was showing. His usual easy charm was replaced by sharp words and defensive explanations. The breaking point came during the weekly staff meeting. David was presenting the quarterly projections when Tom Williams from operations raised a question about the European expansion timeline. "Given the current audit situation," Tom said carefully, "should we be proceeding with such a major investment?" "The audit is routine," David snapped. "It has nothing to do with our growth plans." "But if there are concerns about how resources have been allocated." "There are no concerns," David's voice echoed across the conference room. The audit is my mother's way of staying involved. It doesn't reflect any actual problems with company operations. The room fell silent. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah Chin looked down at her notes, while Michael Torres studied his hands. Unless, David continued, his voice getting louder, people prefer to let fear and second-guessing derail everything we've worked to build. Nobody responded. The confident leader, who'd been toasting his empire just weeks before, was now publicly losing his composure, alienating the very people he needed to support him. After the meeting, I received 3 private messages from employees expressing concern about David's leadership style. The cracks weren't just showing, they were widening into fissures that would soon become impossible to hide. The first domino had fallen. Soon, the rest would follow. James Morrison's call came on a Thursday afternoon, his voice carefully neutral in the way that signaled serious concern. "Helen, I hope you don't mind me calling directly." "Of course not, James. How can I help you?" "I've been hearing some interesting rumors about an audit at Hartwell Industries. Given my investment in the company, I wanted to get the story straight from the source." I smiled, settling back in my chair. James Morrison had invested $2 million in our expansion plans, and his confidence was crucial to our industry reputation. "Just routine due diligence, James. Making sure all our financial systems are running smoothly."
I see.
"And you're still involved in company oversight?" The question was delicately phrased, but the meaning was clear. James had been dealing with David for months, operating under the assumption that I'd stepped back from active management. Now, he was questioning whether that assumption was correct. "I've never stopped being involved," I said carefully. "I may have been less visible lately, but I'm still very much committed to the company's success." "Good to hear. David's ambitious, which I appreciate, but experience has its value too." "Indeed it does." After I hung up, I made a note in my private file. If James Morrison was calling me directly, other investors were probably having similar concerns. David's confidence had been built on the perception that he had full control of the company. If that perception was cracking, his entire foundation would start to crumble, which was exactly what I was counting on. Despite the growing pressure, David seemed determined to maintain his lifestyle and image. That weekend, a gleaming red Porsche appeared in the company parking lot. David's new toy, purchased with what I strongly suspected was a company loan disguised as executive compensation. Monday morning, he made a show of arriving in the sports car, parking it prominently where everyone could see. Several employees gathered around it during lunch, admiring the sleek lines and expensive details. "Nice ride," I heard Michael Torres comment. "Thanks," David replied, his confidence seemingly restored. Sometimes you have to invest in success to attract success. That afternoon, I reviewed the latest financial reports from the bank. Sure enough, there was a $50,000 executive advance approved just days before the car appeared. Money that the company could barely afford, used to fund David's personal indulgences. I documented everything, adding it to the growing file that would soon tell a very compelling story about fiscal irresponsibility and questionable judgment. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. David was doing such a thorough job of destroying his own credibility that I barely needed to intervene. Better to let him continue digging his own grave while I prepared the perfect moment to push him into it. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday, and David had called a preliminary strategy session with his inner circle. They gathered in the conference room, unaware that the intercom system I'd had installed years ago was still connected to my office. "The old lady's trying to undermine everything we've built," David's voice came through clearly. "But she's not going to succeed." "What's her plan?" asked Jennifer Walsh, the marketing director David had hired over my objections. "Simple. We present the European expansion as a done deal. Show the board that we're committed to growth, that we're not going to be held back by conservative thinking." "What about the audit?" This from Peter Kim, the financial analyst who'd replaced someone with 20 years of experience. "The audit will show exactly what I wanted to show. A company that's growing rapidly, taking necessary risks, positioning itself for market dominance. And if your mother objects?" David's laugh was cold and confident. My mother is a relic from a different era. She built something impressive for her time, but she doesn't understand modern business. The board knows that. The investors know that. When it comes down to it, they'll choose vision over nostalgia every time. I listened to my son dismiss my 3 decades of experience, my relationships with every major client, my intimate knowledge of every aspect of the business we'd built together. He saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be overcome, a voice from the past that needed to be silenced. That recording would be very useful when the time came to remind the board exactly who they were really choosing between. That evening, Richard confronted me in our kitchen, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Helen, you need to stop this nonsense immediately." "What nonsense?" "The audit, the bank restrictions, whatever game you're playing with David. He came to see me today, and he's furious." "I imagine he is. This is our son, Helen. Our only child. How can you sabotage him like this?" I looked at my husband. This man who had benefited from every success I'd achieved, but had never once stood up for me when I was attacked or dismissed. "I'm not sabotaging anyone, Richard. I'm protecting a company I built from someone who's destroying it. David isn't destroying anything. He's growing the business, expanding into new markets, bringing fresh ideas. David is hemorrhaging money, alienating clients, and treating experienced employees like disposable obstacles. He's turned my collaborative workplace into a dictatorship run by incompetence and arrogance." "You're jealous," Richard said, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. "You can't stand that he's succeeding without you." The betrayal was complete. My own husband, choosing our son's feelings over the truth, dismissing my legitimate concerns as petty jealousy. "You're right about one thing," I said quietly. "He is succeeding without me. But not for much longer." Richard's face crumpled. "Helen, please. Don't destroy our family over business." "I'm not destroying our family, Richard. I'm saving it. Because if David continues on this path, there won't be anything left to inherit except debt and failure." Sunday night, I sat in my home office with 2 files spread before me. One contained the original incorporation documents, stock certificates, and legal papers that proved my majority ownership. The other held months of evidence documenting David's mismanagement, questionable expenses, and deteriorating relationships with clients and staff. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine the future of Hartwell Industries. David would present his European expansion proposal with confidence, certain that his charm and vision would carry the day. He had no idea that I'd already spoken privately with 3 of the 5 board members, sharing my concerns about the company's financial stability and strategic direction. I'd prepared my presentation carefully, not an emotional appeal from a wounded mother, but a clinical analysis from an experienced business owner who'd built something successful and was watching it be dismantled by reckless leadership. The numbers told the story clearly: declining client retention, increasing debt, questionable expenditures, and expansion plans that were built on wishful thinking rather than solid market research. Tomorrow, the board would have to choose between David's flashy promises and my documented concerns, between vision and experience, between the future and the foundation. I was confident about their choice, but I was also prepared for war, if necessary. Because at the end of the day, I didn't need the board's approval to save my company. I was the majority shareholder. I owned 62% of Hartwell Industries. And tomorrow, everyone was going to remember exactly what that meant. The conference room had been transformed for the occasion. David had arranged for catered breakfast, professional presentation boards, and bound copies of his expansion proposal for each board member. He clearly intended this to be his moment of triumph. I arrived precisely on time, taking my seat at the far end of the table where I could observe everyone's reactions. The board members, James Morrison, Patricia Valdez, Robert Chin, Diana Walsh, and Thomas Bradley, settled into their chairs with the serious expressions of people who understood they were making crucial decisions. "Thank you all for being here," David began, his confidence radiating across the room. "Today marks a pivotal moment for Hartwell Industries. We're not just discussing growth. We're discussing transformation. His presentation was polished and impressive. Charts showing projected revenue increases, market analysis supporting European expansion, testimonials from potential overseas partners. He painted a picture of a company poised for exponential growth, limited only by the courage to seize opportunities. The numbers are clear, he concluded after 40 minutes of dazzling projections. This expansion will double our revenue within 18 months and establish us as a major player in the international market. The board members nodded appreciatively. James Morrison asked several technical questions, all of which David answered with practiced ease. Even I had to admit that as a presentation it was masterful. "Thank you, David," said Patricia Valdez, the board chair. "Before we discuss approval, I believe Helen has some information to share." All eyes turned to me. David's confident smile faltered slightly, as if he'd forgotten I might have something to say about the future of my own company. "Thank you, Patricia." I stood slowly, opening my own folder with deliberate care. I do indeed have some information that I believe is relevant to today's discussion. First, I said, distributing copies of the audit report that had arrived that morning, "I'd like you to review the findings from our independent financial audit." David's face went white. "Mom, this isn't the time." "On the contrary, this is exactly the time." I turned to address the board directly. "The audit reveals several concerning patterns that I believe you should understand before approving any expansion plans." Silence fell over the room as the board members scanned the document. The auditors had been thorough and devastating in their findings. Questionable consulting fees totaling $300,000. Unauthorized executive compensation disguised as business expenses. Cash flow problems masked by creative accounting. "These consulting fees," James Morrison said slowly. "What services were provided for these payments?" David opened his mouth to respond, but I continued before he could speak. "The auditors were unable to identify any deliverables or documented services for those payments. The companies receiving the funds appear to exist only on paper." Patricia Valdez looked up sharply. "Are you suggesting fraud?" "I'm suggesting that company resources have been misallocated in ways that compromise our financial stability and violate fiduciary responsibility." "This is ridiculous," David burst out. "Those were legitimate business expenses. For services that can't be documented to companies that don't actually exist," I said calmly. "The audit also found that we've lost 6 major clients in the past 8 months, representing nearly 30% of our recurring revenue." Robert Chun whistled low. "David, you told us client retention was strong." "Some client turnover is normal in any growth phase." "These clients specifically requested to work with me," I interrupted. "When they learned I was no longer actively involved, they took their business elsewhere. Companies we'd worked with for over a decade." The board members exchanged glances. Diana Walsh frowned at the financial projections David had presented. "If we've lost 30% of our client base, how are these revenue projections possible?" "They're not," I said simply. "The European expansion is built on fantasy numbers designed to hide declining domestic performance." David was standing now, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "This is exactly what I was talking about. Old thinking that holds back progress. Yes, we've had some client turnover, but that's because we're evolving beyond our original market." "David." My voice cut through his explanation like ice. "Sit down. I will not be lectured about business by someone who doesn't understand."
"Seat. Down."
The authority in my voice surprised even me. David hesitated, clearly torn between continuing his defense and responding to a tone of command he hadn't heard from me in years. "I think," said Thomas Bradley carefully, "we need to understand the full situation before making any decisions." I reached into my folder and withdrew the documents I'd been saving for this moment. "You're absolutely right, Thomas. Let me clarify the full situation." I placed the stock certificates on the table where everyone could see them. "These documents establish that I own 62% of Hartwell Industries. I am not just a concerned mother or a nostalgic founder. I am the majority shareholder of this company." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. Patricia Valdez was the first to speak. "Helen, We were under the impression that you'd transferred ownership to David when you stepped back from operations.
No.
I reduced my involvement in day-to-day operations, but I never transferred ownership. Legally and contractually, I control this company. James Morrison leaned forward, studying the documents. These look authentic. They are authentic. Filed with the state, properly notarized, never rescinded or modified. I looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. David has been operating under the false assumption that he owns something that actually belongs to me. David finally found his voice. You can't just, we've been running this company for 3 years. You've been running my company, I corrected. And based on the audit findings, you've been running it into the ground. The next hour was brutal and decisive. With the audit report and ownership documents on the table, David's carefully constructed narrative crumbled like a house of cards. The board reviewed every questionable decision, every missing client, every expense that couldn't be justified. David tried to defend himself, but each explanation only highlighted his inexperience and poor judgment. The consulting fees were for strategic planning. By companies that don't exist, Patricia Valdez said flatly. The client losses were temporary setbacks caused by alienating people who'd worked with us for decades, Robertson observed. The expansion projections are based on solid market research. Research that ignores our declining domestic base and assumes growth rates that are completely unrealistic, Diana Walsh concluded. When the board called for a vote on David's proposal, the result. Given the findings in this audit, Thomas Bradley said heavily, and the clear mismanagement of company resources, I move that David Hartwell be removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer. Seconded, said James Morrison immediately. David's face went through a range of emotions, shock, anger, denial, and finally, devastating comprehension. You can't do this. I built this expansion plan. I brought in new investors. I modernized everything. You nearly bankrupted us, I said quietly. You drove away our most valuable clients, spent money we didn't have on things we didn't need, and treated experienced employees like obstacles to your personal ambition. The vote was again unanimous. David was removed from all executive positions, effective immediately. Richard, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. Helen, surely this is too extreme. Richard, I said, not taking my eyes off my son, your opinion on business matters was noted and rejected 30 years ago. It hasn't improved with age. After the board members left, David and I sat alone in the conference room. The expansion materials were scattered across the table like the debris of a failed campaign. I can't believe you did this, he said finally, his voice hollow. What did you expect, David? That I would let you destroy everything I built? I was growing the company. You were feeding your ego at the company's expense. You mistook spending for investing, arrogance for confidence, and disrespect for leadership. But I'm your son. The words hung between us, a plea that came 3 months too late. Yes, you are my son, which is why this hurts more than you'll ever understand. I stood up, gathering my documents. I wanted to give you everything, David. The business, the legacy, the security I never had growing up. But you had to earn it. You had to prove you could respect what came before while building something better. I was trying. You were trying to erase me. You dismissed my experience, mocked my contributions, and treated me like an embarrassing relic who needed to be pushed aside. I looked at him, this stranger who wore my son's face. You told me to stay out of your business. So I'm showing you whose business it really is. I walked toward the door, then paused. The company will recover, David. I'll rebuild the client relationships you destroyed, hire back the experienced people you drove away, and clean up the financial mess you created. It will take time, but it can be done. And what about me? That depends entirely on you. You can accept a junior position, learn humility, and maybe, work your way back to respect. Or you can let your pride destroy the last chance you'll get to be part of something meaningful. I opened the door to find Margaret Foster waiting in the hallway, a stack of resumes in her hands, applications from former employees who'd heard about the changes and wanted to return. Mrs. Hartwell, she said with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. Welcome back. Behind me, I heard David make a sound that might have been a sob or a curse. I didn't turn around to check. 32 years ago, I'd built Hartwell Industries from nothing. Today, I'd saved it from someone who'd forgotten that empires built on arrogance and disrespect never last. My son had told me to stay out of his business. But this was never his business, it was mine. And now everyone knew it.